The last 2 days I was feeling totally antsy, like there were ants in my brain cells doing a dance, and not a very coordinated one. But today I feel a little bit more organized, and I think it's okay to have those days that are sort of chaotic, because I actually watched a really cool movie called I Origins, or I Origin, I can't remember. And had I not felt kind of tired and kind of like I didn't know what to do on my to-do list of things I need to do before I go, then I wouldn't have watched that movie. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought it was quite profound. I like those movies that are kind of scientific, but not really, because it's not really true, but it could be true. Sort of like psychological thrillers or just psychological dramas in a way. So that was a really good movie. I definitely recommend it to myself. And yesterday I didn't feel like making a video because I felt sort of off, and I really didn't know what to do with myself, so I was watching TED Talks on Apple TV. And usually when I watch them on my computer. And the app on Apple TV is sort of limited in what you can pick, or at least there's sort of this pre-selection that isn't necessarily the best per se, but it's kind of random. So I was watching them randomly, and I gravitated towards the ones about the brain and neuroscience, and it was talking about neurogenesis. And there was this doctor on there who is a neuroscientist, and she gave a story of how she said one of her friends, who is also a doctor but an oncologist, was saying that even when some of his patients would hear that they were in full remission from the treatment, from the drugs and the chemo and everything, they would still get depression. And she said back to them, that's because the drugs given to stop the cancer cells from multiplying also stop the baby neurons from being born and generated in the brain, which is called neurogenesis. And then I think she said that the cancer doctor said back that adults don't grow new neurons, which is something he might have learned in school, but neuroscientists know that we do generate new neurons. And then she went on to talk about that the main part that they study, at least, that generates new neurons is the hippocampus. And I've talked about that before in terms of the euphoric sensation and implicit and explicit memories, which is what Dr. Daniel Siegel talks about. But they're talking about how that's one place where there's definitely neurogenesis. And one scientist predicted or thought that there could be 700 neurons born per day in the hippocampus, or generated, I should say. So I find this stuff interesting because she talked about to the cancer doctor friend about how cancer drugs stop neurogenesis. To me, it could be possible that some of the psych meds stop neurogenesis, and that might be a way to stop some of the psychosis. It could be numbing the brain of neurogenesis in general. And I think neurogenesis happens when we see something new, we see something more beyond what we normally see. So it's blocking that. It's blocking us from seeing something new and generating new brain cells. So I thought that was interesting just because it was the first time I've ever heard someone say, a doctor say, that a drug actually stops neurogenesis and that could cause depression. Because to me, a lot of what happens in mania is the opposite of that. It's maybe too much neurogenesis, or not being able to support oneself through that second brain growth, which I also talked about in videos a long time ago. And I don't remember what I said exactly, but I really doubt that anybody's tried to measure the neurogenesis of somebody in mania. They're just scratching the surface of actually being able to measure this neurogenesis thing. And so I might skip all over the place today a little bit because I changed my note taking process to an actual paper book. So I'm not looking at the computer so much, and I'm again embodied, writing with my hands instead of typing and staring at the computer screen. So maybe it'll be a little bit less organized, but I don't really care. And another thing she talked about with the neurogenesis was she talked about things that help neurogenesis. She talked about running has actually been studied to help neurogenesis. She even said chewing crunchy foods. So in the spirit of that, I went and I bought something to masticate with. I realized I haven't been chewing anything crunchy. These are good, even though I bought the non-organic ones. I didn't want to pay double the price. I'm just really not having a flow of blah blah, I won't say it. She also said resveratrol from grapes or red wine helps with neurogenesis, and so does blueberries. And I think that's part of what I'm really interested in, is just brain growth, brain change, brain state change, altered states, but actually making them stages, making them sustainable, and also making them into something to be curious about instead of afraid of. I was thinking about how it felt like I could hear aliens in my head again this time. It's almost like there are aliens in my brain. I'm taking lithium, and I have been for nearly 6 years, and that's something that is alien to my brain, and it's a salt. And I talked to the people at the Point of Return .org or something who help people get off meds, and she said lithium is a salt that accumulates in your brain, and so my brain is being assaulted. It's full of salt, it's full of lithium salt. So it could be symbolic, it could be this holographic projection of some element of truth, but it's just being misrepresented by sound, by thoughts. It could be my brain trying to tell me there's something in my brain. Maybe it's time to get off the lithium at some point. And maybe the brain, just like the body doesn't really know how to talk to us, and the brain doesn't really know how to talk to us, the brain itself. It's like the language of emotions and the language of gestures and the language of our body. So when something's wrong, it's like feeding us this stuff that's like delusion or hallucination. But it's one of the only ways that the brain can actually talk to us, or the body can talk to us. Sometimes it talks to us by getting some kind of physical disease, and then the doctor talks to us and tells us, well, this is what the physical disease is. But if we didn't have a doctor to tell us that, we would eventually feel some kind of pain, or maybe even have hallucinations or something. For example, I know somebody with Wilson's disease, and it's a rare genetic disease that causes copper to accumulate in the brain. And then a person starts to hallucinate eventually when they have the onset of it in their late teens or early 20s. And a lot of times these people are misperceived to be on drugs or something, until a million tests later find out they have this Wilson's disease, this copper accumulation in the brain and body because of the liver not being able to process it properly. So the hallucination is a way for the brain to be saying there's something going on in the brain. And I feel too like the hallucinations that we get with so-called mental illness are something going on in the brain, but it's maybe not necessarily a physical problem, though it could be physically represented, though we can't actually measure it. What I'm trying to say, it's the environment. The brain is perceiving the environment, the society that we've created as human beings together, and it's telling us that this is not the right environment for the brain. And so the brain starts producing these hallucinations, and we think that the person has a problem, but it's not a person's personal problem. It's the whole collective. It's evolutionary. These people are compasses for what we are all encompassed in. An aside is that this is one of my earthing mats, and it's good to be connected to the earth. It plugs into the grounding outlet, and sometimes I remember to use it, but it has to be on bare skin for it to be effective. But I like to put my computer on it, so then I'm grounded when I'm on my computer. And I have an earthing sheet for my bed that is plugged into the wall as well. So it's like sleeping on the grass without having to sleep on the grass. And what I was going to say about feeling weird for 2 days. It could have been PMS, and it probably was, but also I took it as a sign to start again taking SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine, E, something like that. And I was taking before, but when I was on a bit more trazodone, which is an antidepressant, I stopped taking it. And when I was taking the extra Seroquel, because I think it's a little bit contraindicated. So last night I went down to 1 trazodone instead of 1.5, and I took SAMe this morning. So it could be helping me to feel a little bit better, a little bit more able to perceive, I think. I was going to say be motivated or focus, but I think it's more like being able to see. Because being able to see is just seeing and acting. So I will go down to a lower amount of trazodone. Neurogenesis. I remember reading that chewing something crunchy helps with depression, and it's likely because of this neurogenesis thing. And I've also started taking some St. John's wort again, which is also something not good to take with antidepressants. And trazodone is an antidepressant, though I take it for sleep. So I don't want to be on too much trazodone if I'm on the St. John's wort and the SAMe. And these are the things I take for me, that I had DNA testing with my naturopath to discover that these would be good for me. So everybody's different. I actually feel that I've read that SAMe is contraindicated for bipolar. So it has to be done carefully and under the supervision of a naturopath. So other things that are good for neurogenesis from this presentation were flavonoids, which is from the blueberries, as well as intermittent fasting. And I know Dr. Mercola is going to write a book about this soon, or is in the process. And that could be something like just not eating on Sunday, or not eating except for a 4-hour period of time. That's another one that some people do. They'll eat all their food between 12 and 4, and that's it. So having that period of fasting. Another way of fasting is ketogenic diet. It's not really fasting, but it's kind of fasting. in a way. It helps to regenerate the mitochondria. And also caloric restriction, so eating less food. And that's something I've been doing naturally for the last month and a half or so. I just started eating less, mainly partly because of stress, but then I sort of stuck with it, and now I just eat breakfast and dinner, and I don't eat huge meals. Whereas before I'd be hungry all day, and it sort of made my body not hungry all day long anymore, and I feel a bit lighter. So I think I'm probably doing the whole caloric restriction right now on most days. And I like it because it's totally removed the habit of eating, and I don't feel like this hungry, ravenous person all the time. And the next thing for me will be to eat healthier. I want to introduce some spirulina, eat carrots or something crunchy, eat some more blueberries like this whole neurogenesis thing talks about. Also, folic acid and zinc were said to be neurogenic, as well as curcumin from turmeric, and omega-3 fatty acids from fish oil. I do take fish oil, I do take zinc, I take folic acid as well. And also it says that vitamin A deficiency and B deficiency can cause neurogenesis to turn off. So that's like saying that it's important to have enough vitamin A and B vitamins. And high sugar is not good for neurogenesis. And I'm pretty sure I talked about how a lady I saw speak said that sugar turns off BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that's another thing that's important for brain cell growth. And so that was a TED Talk by Sandrine Thuray. And there was another TED Talk I watched, which was by Jocelyn Blow, which was about how the brain might be able to repair itself, because the brain isn't good at self-repair. But they found some cells that in culture turned into stem cells, and they were able to grow those cells under very specific conditions and then put them back in the brain of monkeys, unfortunately. And then the monkey's brain actually healed, and the monkey was able to do the task faster again. And they were saying if the brain was healthy and not damaged, then when they re-injected these stem cells, they just sort of redistributed themselves in the brain and didn't really do anything. They just kind of disappeared, or it wasn't clear whether they just redistributed themselves or whether they kind of did that and dissolved, or they just went somewhere else. So that wasn't clear, but I just found it interesting. They said those brain cells are active when we're a fetus and our brains are needing to fold. And I was thinking that, and this is just playing with thinking about this, they were able to find these cells and then see these stem cells, and then they had to grow them in a very specific culture, and they had to do a lot of different experiments to find out how they could culture these cells, how they could get them to grow. It makes me wonder what brain condition naturally would have to be there for them to be a culture, like for them to be naturally cultured in the brain. So if these cells are like stem cells, but not really, they were sort of specific kind of cells, could there be a time when our brain is in a certain state that requires new folds? Like, imagine that it grows. Imagine that with our ego thinking and our dopamine brain, it's kind of limited. We're using this 5% or however they say it. And then through this second brain growth, this neurogenesis, neuroplasticity of, I want to say, supposed mental illness, because people are seeing things beyond, and this perception that is actually growing and changing the brain. Maybe people like that are using those cells to create new folds in the brain. I wonder, because Krishnamurti talks about a radical mutation in the mind. We actually have to undergo a radical mutation in the mind. And I feel like it's possible he knew stuff about the brain just by really inquiring like he did. But he wasn't a scientist, and he couldn't prove these things scientifically, though they may be proven. But he never went into real depth about what he was talking about. He did sometimes, but you find pieces here and there of him going into the depth of what it was he perceived. What I'm saying is, if there is such a thing as a radical mutation in the mind through, say, enlightenment, for example, maybe those cells that are part of the repair will repair our brains. Maybe our brains are sort of damaged as they are as egos, because we're thinking about ourselves all the time. We're not really seeing. But if we switch to seeing and say someone moves toward enlightenment, maybe their brain does mutate, and maybe those cells do get used. They just think they're there. They've got to be there for a reason. Because the thing is, they can't just be for repair, because if they were, then when somebody's brain got really damaged, they would go in and do the repair, but they don't. But they just happen to discover these cells, and they're able to really culture them in very specific medium, and then inject them back in to a monkey, and then the monkey gets better. Maybe they're for a different kind of repair that we don't know about, because we think that the way our brains operate now, the way we've been programmed, is the natural state, when it's not. I think those cells could be there to actually repair and refold and mutate our brains, either when somebody moves towards enlightenment, or actually at some point in the future of humanity, when there's a large enough selective pressure for that environment to be created within the brain and body and perception to activate those cells to change the brain to the next evolution of whatever it is that we're supposed to evolve into. They could be actually for us to evolve to the next level of humanity. Could be just a switch that makes our heads a little bigger, and then those things fold the brain a little bit more, and we got a bigger brain, and oof, we look like aliens. I just like to think about that stuff. And the other thing they don't talk about much with this whole neurogenesis thing, they don't talk about the interpersonal aspect. I think about Dr. Daniel Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology, and how the brain is a relational organ. It's a social organ. And those social connections and that empathy and compassion and friendship grows our brain. Without social connection, without touch, without so many things, our brain atrophies. And even how I discovered that skin-to-skin touch for humans actually increases blood flow due to that whole changing the right changing the charge between the blood cells and the walls of the vessels so it can go through properly. And then we're more oxygenated, and when we're more oxygenated, we have more blood flow to the brain, and when we have more blood flow to the brain, there can be more neurogenesis. That's part of what running does, is it increases blood flow. Well, so does physical touch. So this connection, even looking into somebody's eyes, I'm sure, increases oxygen. So all these other things, these relational things, these perceiving kindness and doing kind gestures and kind acts, would also grow the brain. It grows the social brain, it grows the relational brain. So they often talk about in terms of, oh, eat your blueberries and have your omega-3s, but you can do that all you want if you're not relating based on altruistic and empathetic and compassionate principles. Your brain is going to be shriveling up faster than if you were to eat blueberries every day, all day, for the rest of your life. So many of these things we need because we've been trained to use our minds the wrong way. So I wonder about interpersonal neurogenesis. Another thing I did today, I got my glitter. Remember what that's for? Oh yeah. So a better question might be, what is the brain trying to tell us by hallucinating? It's not telling us something about the person, it's telling us about the condition it's in, the environment it's in, what it sees beyond what we don't see. And it's also trying to show us the dangers of thought and thinking and the self and the personal me, and being isolated in our perceptions. And when we relate our perceptions to our own personal self, it's always isolating. And in terms of the relational neurogenesis, I think back to when I was in the psych ward and that person that I know visited me, and it was the most hopeless day and I felt terrible, and after she left, I felt so much better. It was almost like her presence, her care, her seeing me and witnessing me unconditionally jump-started my neurogenesis because of our relationship. We already had a connection. And we had a connection, and then she came to physically connect. And that connection and all those associations with that, she brought all those positive associations. Because she was from a place where I had more associations, it almost just turned those relational circuits on, and those were able to usurp the circuits that were very antsy because of the medication that I was put on that I wasn't doing well on. And that's the